Okay, so our server has been restarted. Now let's go to the server manager again. I'm currently on from the jump box. I have again RDP on my AD server. Now let's open the server manager and let's see if the domain controller has been installed successfully or not. So let's open the server manager and go on tools, Active Directory. See, you can see these new tools that has been installed. So let's open Active Directory users and computers. If you can see the avengers.com domain has been installed. Now let's configure our DNS. So forward lookup zone has already been created. If we want, we can create the reverse lookup zone, but it's not yet needed as of now. So our DNS server is also ready, and we already have this EC2 server name as a host A record. So if you can see, the IP address is matched over here, 10.0.130.224. This is the IP address. So in order to configure this server as a domain control, we have to change the network IP address of this server. Go to the Ethernet part, change the adapter option, cancel. So here, if we can see, we can our avengers.com network has been established. Now let's create one user for our domain controller. So let's go to the Active Directory users and computers, and let's create one user that will be used to access all the servers. So let's hit on new, create user, and the name of the user will be AWS AON. Logon name will be AWS AON. Next, you can give some random password. Password never expires. Next, next. So this user has been created. Now let's grant some permission to this user. So if we can see over here, administrator, let's make our user as a part of the administrator. And okay, AWS AON. Okay, and also domain controller administrator. Let's see more options. Action. Let's go on view and select advanced features so we can see all the options in the domain controller. And now if we see on the computer section, we don't have any computer as of now added. And in the user section, we can see these are the users that we have and these are the groups that we have. Let's make it as a DNS admin members at AWS AON and add this user. Let's also make it as a domain admin AWS AON. So this user will be used to add other servers in the domain and also to access the server. So I am giving maximum privilege that we can give to this user. So it's easy for us to configure the always on. In the real scenario, you will have one user for the domain controller, one user for the AD servers, one user to join the servers, another user for SQL server. So in this, we are using only one user, that is AWS, and that plays the role of all the other users. So in spite of creating different users for different role, I'm creating one user and using that user to perform all the functions. And one more thing, and now let's log off from this server and try to log in with our AWS AON. I can say disconnect, and now let's log in with our domain controller. With our domain, we already have our domain. We don't have to log in with the local administrator now. Use different AV and AWS AON. Let's see if this works. This works. So our user is correctly configured. Now we are able to access the domain controller by our AWS AON user. We can add the jump box also into the domain, but we don't need it. We will add both the SQL servers in the domain. Let's go to the network Ethernet part. In the Ethernet, we have to change the DNS. So the DNS of this server will be 127.0.0.1. So if I do a NS lookup on this server, see, I can get this IP address. So now our AD server is ready. Domain controller has been configured. Now let's start with our SQL servers. So I have written the SQL Server IP addresses and the password in this notepad, so it's easy for us to use. So now let's log in on the first SQL Server that we have, and let's try to join this server in the domain. And use the password. Let's simultaneously log on the other SQL Server that we have, SQL Server 1S, so we can configure both the servers side by side. Let's copy the password. So this is SQL Server 1S. So now we have logged it on both our servers, 1P and 1S. So let's rename these servers so it's easy for us to use. So let's start with SQL Server first. Let's open the SQL Server instance that is already installed on the server. When we use EC2 server with SQL Server, we use the image to launch this SQL Server with SQL Server Enterprise Edition. So SQL Server is already installed on this server. SQL Server. Let's SQL Server, open SQL Server Management Studio, and let me show you one thing. When we use the images that are provided by AWS, the administrative user has sysadmin access on the SQL instance that is already installed. So either we can uninstall that SQL instance, install a new SQL instance, or we can add our domain controller ID on that SQL instance, so we don't have to install a new SQL server for this. As of now, I will create a SQL authenticated ID on this SQL instance. So once this server is added in the domain, we will able to access the SQL server using the SQL authenticated ID and then add our domain ID, that is AWS AON. I will show you. So this is the SQL Server 1P on which we are opening, and let's do the same thing on SQL Server 1S. SQL Server Management. First time when we open the management studio, it takes some time to configure. So let me pause the video.